I hid my award-winning portrait painting talent behind a police badge for 12 years, convinced that my art had driven my brother to suicide and that I deserved nothing but the cold reality of traffic violations and accident reports. Every day I buried the brushes deeper in storage, ignored the canvases gathering dust, and told myself that I was protecting the world from the dangerous gift that had destroyed my family. But when I was sketching a witness statement for a routine fender bender, an elderly man recognized my distinctive artistic technique and said words that shattered everything I believed about my brother's death. He had been my brother's teacher, he had been searching for me for over a decade, and he was carrying a letter that would prove I had been wrong about everything that mattered most. My name is Aria, and this is about how I spent 12 years running from the talent that defined me, how I convinced myself that being extraordinary at something meant I was responsible for tragedy, and how one witness sketch on a Tuesday afternoon in March 2023 brought me face to face with a truth that would change everything I thought I knew about love, loss, and the real reason my brother left this world. It started on a morning that felt like every other morning for the past 12 years. I woke up at 5:30 in my small apartment on the outskirts of Portland, made black coffee in the same chipped mug I had been using since 2011, and put on the same navy blue uniform that had become my armor against the person I used to be. Officer Aria Chen, badge number 4827, Traffic Division. That was who I was now. Not Aria Chen, the portrait artist whose work had been featured in galleries across 3 states before I turned 25. Not the woman whose paintings had sold for thousands of dollars and whose commissions had waiting lists 6 months long. Not the sister who had been so proud of her artistic gift that she had convinced her younger brother Danny to pursue his own creative dreams. Danny had been everything I was not. Where I was methodical and precise with my brushstrokes, he was wild and experimental with his photography. Where I painted portraits that captured the soul behind someone's eyes, he captured moments of pure emotion in black and white images that made people stop breathing when they looked at them. He was 3 years younger than me, 22 when he died, and he had the kind of raw artistic talent that made gallery owners fight over his work and made other photographers study his techniques like ancient texts. In 2011, I had just finished my most successful year as a professional artist. 3 of my portraits had won national competitions, I had been featured on the cover of Contemporary Art Quarterly, and the Meridian Gallery in downtown Portland was preparing for my first major solo exhibition. The show was scheduled to open in April, and the advance reviews were calling it a career-defining moment for one of the most promising young portraitists in the Pacific Northwest. But Danny was struggling. He had always been sensitive, the kind of person who felt everything too deeply and could not shake off the weight of the world's sadness. In high school, he had been the quiet kid who sat in the back of the classroom, taking photographs of his classmates when they were not looking, capturing expressions of loneliness and hope that most people tried to hide. His teachers told our parents that he had a gift, but they also worried about his tendency to disappear into himself for days at a time. When Danny graduated, I encouraged him to apply to art school, to pursue photography seriously instead of just treating it as a hobby. I helped him put together his portfolio, wrote recommendation letters, and even offered to help with tuition if he needed it. I was so excited about my own success that I wanted to share it with him. Wanted him to experience the rush of seeing your work displayed in a gallery, of having strangers moved to tears by something you created with your own hands. Danny got accepted to the Portland Institute of Photography, a prestigious program that only took 30 students each year. I was more excited than he was when the acceptance letter came. I remember calling him from my studio, paint still wet on my hands from the portrait I had been working on, telling him how proud I was and how this was going to be the beginning of something amazing for both of us. But Danny's excitement seemed forced, like he was trying to match my enthusiasm but could not quite manage it. When I asked him about it, he said he was happy but nervous, that he did not know if he was good enough to be in a program with students who had been training their whole lives. I told him he was being ridiculous, that his work was better than anything I had seen from people twice his age, and that he just needed to have confidence in his abilities. I was so busy with my own career during those months that I did not notice how quiet Danny had become. My studio was in a converted warehouse downtown, and I was spending 14 hours a day there, working on the pieces for my upcoming exhibition. When Danny called, I would talk to him while I painted, the phone wedged between my shoulder and ear, only half listening because I was concentrating on getting the light right in someone's eyes or the shadow perfect along a jawline. He would tell me about his classes, about the other students, about projects he was working on, and I would make encouraging noises while I mixed colors or cleaned brushes. I thought I was being supportive, but looking back, I realize I was treating our conversations like background noise, something pleasant to fill the silence while I focused on what I considered the important work. In February, Danny started missing classes. At first, it was just 1 or 2 days here and there, but by March, he was barely showing up at all. His professors called him, then called our parents, then called me. Everyone was worried, but I was in the final stages of preparing for my exhibition, and I told myself that Danny was just going through a rough patch, that he would pull himself together once he saw how successful art could be when he came to my opening night. I remember the conversation we had 2 weeks before my exhibition was supposed to open. Danny had called me at the studio around 9 at night, and I could tell immediately that something was wrong. His voice was flat, empty, like all the emotion had been drained out of it. He said, "Aria, I do not think I am cut out for this." I said, "Cut out for what, Danny?" "School. You just need to get back to class. You are talented, you just need to push through this difficult period." He said, "No, I mean art. All of it. I look at what you do, how good you are, how easy it seems for you, and I realize I will never be that good. I will never matter the way you matter." I was frustrated because I had 3 paintings to finish before the exhibition, and I could not understand why Danny was being so negative when everything was going so well for both of us. I said, "Danny, you are being ridiculous. You are incredibly talented, and talent is not a competition. There is room for both of us to be successful." He said, "But what if there is not room for me to be happy?" The question should have stopped me in my tracks. It should have made me put down my brushes, leave my studio, and go sit with my brother until I understood what he was really asking me. But I was so focused on my work, so convinced that success would solve all our problems, that I treated his pain like an inconvenience. I said, "Danny, you are going to be happy. You are going to see how amazing art can be when you come to my opening. You are going to remember why you love photography, and everything is going to make sense again." He was quiet for a long time, and then he said, "Okay, Aria. I will see you at your opening." But he did not see me at my opening, because 5 days before the exhibition was supposed to start, Danny locked himself in his apartment and took every pill in his medicine cabinet. The note he left was only 2 sentences long. "I am sorry I could not be as good as Aria. Maybe now she can be successful without having to worry about her failure of a brother." When our parents called to tell me Danny was dead, I was in my studio putting the final touches on a portrait of a young woman whose eyes seemed to follow you around the room. I remember dropping the phone and staring at that painting, at those eyes that suddenly looked like Danny's eyes, and realizing that while I had been creating fake life on canvas, the real life of the person I loved most had been slipping away. The exhibition was cancelled. The gallery offered to postpone it, to wait until I was ready to show the work, but I could not imagine ever being ready to celebrate my art again. How could I stand in front of those paintings and smile while people told me how talented I was, knowing that my talent had convinced my brother he was worthless? I packed up all my paintings, all my brushes, all my easels and palettes and tubes of paint, and I moved everything to a storage unit on the industrial side of town. I told myself it was temporary, that I would go back to art once I had processed my grief, but deep down I knew I was done. Art had killed my brother as surely as if I had handed him those pills myself. The decision to become a police officer came 6 months later, when the reality of Danny's death had settled into my bones like a permanent ache. I needed a job that was the opposite of art, something practical and concrete where success was measured by how well you served others instead of how well you served yourself. Traffic enforcement seemed perfect because it was methodical, rule-based, and completely disconnected from creativity or self-expression. The police academy was brutal in exactly the way I needed it to be. Physical training, classroom instruction, practical exercises. None of it had anything to do with imagination or artistic vision. I was good at it because I was good at following instructions, at paying attention to details, at observing situations carefully and recording what I saw accurately. But I never told anyone that my observational skills came from years of studying human faces, trying to capture not just what people looked like but who they were beneath the surface. My fellow recruits saw me as serious and dedicated but not particularly creative. I never drew anything more complex than basic diagrams, never showed any interest in the artistic aspects of crime scene photography or courtroom sketches. I had built a wall between the person I used to be and the person I needed to become, and I was determined never to let anyone see through it. When I graduated from the academy and was assigned to traffic enforcement, I felt like I had found my penance. 8 hours a day of measuring skid marks, interviewing witnesses, and writing reports about fender benders and parking violations. It was not glamorous work, but it was honest work, the kind of job that helped people without requiring me to expose my soul or risk anyone's life by being too selfish to pay attention. For 12 years, I maintained this balance. I was good at my job, respected by my colleagues, and completely invisible as anything other than a competent police officer. I lived in a small apartment with white walls and no decorations, drove a practical car, and spent my free time reading crime procedurals and watching documentaries about traffic safety. I had successfully erased every trace of the artist I used to be. But art has a way of seeping through even the thickest walls. When I wrote accident reports, my descriptions were more vivid and detailed than necessary. When I interviewed witnesses, I found myself noticing things about their faces and body language that helped me understand what they were really saying versus what they thought they should say. And when I had to draw diagrams of accident scenes, I could not help but make them clearer and more visually informative than the basic sketches most officers produced. My supervising sergeant, Maria Rodriguez, noticed this attention to detail early in my career. She would compliment my reports, tell other officers to look at my diagrams as examples of how to document a scene properly. But she never asked where I had learned to draw, and I never volunteered the information. As far as everyone knew, I was just naturally observant and happened to have neat handwriting. The morning of March 15, 2023, started like any other Tuesday. I was assigned to investigate a 3-car collision at the intersection of 5th and Morrison, a busy corner downtown where the traffic lights had been malfunctioning intermittently for the past 2 weeks. The city was already facing a lawsuit from another accident at the same location, so Sergeant Rodriguez had made it clear that my report needed to be exceptionally thorough and detailed. When I arrived at the scene, I found a delivery truck, a sedan, and a motorcycle with moderate damage and one minor injury to the motorcycle rider. The drivers were all cooperative, and the witnesses were easy to locate. It should have been a straightforward investigation, the kind I could complete in an hour and have the intersection cleared for normal traffic. But as I began interviewing witnesses and measuring the scene, I realized that the malfunctioning traffic light was going to make determining fault much more complicated than usual. The light had been cycling unpredictably between green, yellow, and red for all directions, and each driver had a different story about what color they had seen when they entered the intersection. To make matters worse, the 3 vehicles had come to rest in positions that made it difficult to determine their exact paths of travel before the collision. I was going to need a very precise diagram to show how the accident had occurred, something detailed enough for insurance investigators and possibly a jury to understand. I set up my measuring tape and began the careful work of documenting distances and angles. Then I sat down on the hood of my patrol car with my clipboard and started sketching the intersection, the vehicles, and the sight lines that each driver would have had approaching the collision point. As I worked, I found myself unconsciously using techniques I had learned years ago in art school for creating depth and perspective on a 2-dimensional surface. Instead of drawing simple rectangles to represent the cars, I sketched them with volume and dimension. Instead of basic arrows to show direction of travel, I created flowing lines that showed speed and momentum. Without meaning to, I was making art out of an accident report. I was completely absorbed in the drawing when I heard a voice behind me say, "That is remarkable work, officer. You have exceptional talent." I looked up to see an elderly man in his 70s, well dressed in a charcoal wool coat despite the March warmth. He had intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of weathered hands that suggested a lifetime of working with books or papers. There was something familiar about his face, but I could not place where I might have seen him before. I said, "Thank you, sir. Are you one of the witnesses to the accident?" He said, "Yes, I was crossing the street when the collision occurred." I already gave my statement to Officer Martinez about 20 minutes ago. But I wanted to talk to you about your drawing technique. I felt immediately defensive, the way I always did when anyone showed too much interest in my work. I said, "It is just a standard accident diagram, sir. Nothing special about it." The man studied my face carefully, then looked down at the diagram again. He said, "Officer, I have been teaching art and art history for over 40 years, and I can recognize exceptional skill when I see it. The way you have rendered the perspective, the attention to light and shadow in your shading, the proportional accuracy of your vehicle sketches, these are not skills that come from police training alone." My heart started beating faster. I said, "Sir, I appreciate the compliment, but I'm just trying to create an accurate report for the insurance investigation." He said, "May I ask your name, officer?" I said, "Officer Chen, sir." His eyes widened slightly, and I saw something shift in his expression. He said, "Officer Chen, would your first name happen to be Aria?" When he said my name, I felt like the world had tilted on its axis. I said, "How do you know my name?" He extended his hand and said, "My name is Professor William Henderson. I taught art history at Portland Community College for 35 years before I retired. And I believe I knew your brother Daniel very well." The clipboard slipped from my hands and clattered to the pavement. I said, "You knew Danny?" Professor Henderson said, "Danny was one of my students in 2010 and 2011. He took 3 of my classes: Introduction to Art History, Contemporary Photography, and Visual Narrative Techniques. He was one of the most gifted students I ever taught, but he was also one of the most troubled." I could barely breathe. I said, "Danny never told me he was taking art history classes. He was in photography school." Professor Henderson said, "He was taking my classes as electives, but more than that, he was trying to understand your world. Danny felt like he did not know enough about art to really appreciate what you were accomplishing. He wanted to be able to talk to you about composition and color theory and artistic tradition. He was educating himself so he could be a better brother to you." I felt tears starting to form in my eyes. I said, "He never told me any of this." Professor Henderson said, "Danny was very proud of you, but he was also intimidated by your success. He felt like his photography was amateur compared to your painting, and he was convinced that he would never be able to contribute anything meaningful to your artistic development. So he was working to understand the broader context of art, the history and theory that informed contemporary practice." I said, "But he was incredibly talented. His photographs were better than anything I had ever seen from someone his age." Professor Henderson said, "That is exactly what I used to tell him. But Danny suffered from severe depression and anxiety, and mental illness has a way of distorting our perception of our own abilities. No matter how much talent he had, no matter how much his professors praised his work, he could not shake the feeling that he was not good enough." I said, "If you knew Danny was struggling, why did you not do something to help him?" Professor Henderson looked down at his hands. He said, "I tried, Officer Chen. I really tried. I encouraged him to seek counseling through the school health center. I connected him with other students who were dealing with similar challenges. I even called your parents once, with Danny's permission, to express my concerns about his mental state." He looked up at me. He said, "But there was one thing I could not do, and that was convince Danny that he was worthy of love and success just as he was. He was so focused on comparing himself to you, so convinced that there was only room for one successful artist in your family, that he could not see his own value." I said, "That is insane. I never wanted Danny to feel like he was competing with me. I just wanted him to pursue his passion the way I was pursuing mine." Professor Henderson said, "I know that, and intellectually, Danny knew it too. But depression does not respond to logic. It creates a narrative about yourself that feels absolutely true even when everyone around you is telling you it is false." I said, "Professor Henderson, why are you telling me all this now, 12 years later?" He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an envelope that looked worn from handling. He said, "Because Danny gave me something before he died, something he made me promise to give to you if I ever found you. But after his death, you disappeared from the art world completely. I tried to find you through galleries, through art schools, through mutual contacts, but it was like you had vanished." I stared at the envelope, which had my name written on it in Danny's familiar handwriting. I said, "What is this?" Professor Henderson said, "It is a letter Danny wrote to you 3 weeks before he died. He brought it to my office and asked me to make sure you received it if something happened to him. He said he was planning to give it to you himself at your gallery opening, but he wanted me to have a copy in case he lost his nerve." My hands were shaking as I reached for the envelope. I said, "Danny wrote me a letter before he died." Professor Henderson said, "Yes. And Officer Chen, I think reading this letter might help you understand that Danny's death was not your fault, and that he would not want you to give up the thing that brought him the most joy in his life, which was watching you create beautiful art." I looked around at the accident scene, at the other officers finishing their work, at the tow trucks preparing to clear the intersection. I said, "Professor Henderson, I cannot read this here. This is not the right place." He said, "I understand completely. Would you be willing to meet me somewhere private after you finish your shift? This conversation is 12 years overdue, and I think Danny would want us to have it." I said, "There is a coffee shop called Grounded on 23rd Avenue. Could you meet me there at 4 o'clock? He said, "I will be there. And Officer Chen, I want you to know that finding you today feels like a miracle. I have been carrying this letter for 12 years, hoping I would have the chance to fulfill my promise to your brother." After Professor Henderson left, I tried to focus on completing my accident report, but my hands would not stop shaking. Every few minutes, I would glance at my patrol car where I had placed the envelope on the passenger seat, Danny's handwriting visible through the window. The rest of my shift passed in a blur. I responded to 2 more traffic incidents, wrote 3 parking citations, and attended a brief meeting about new department policies, but I was operating on autopilot. All I could think about was Danny taking art history classes, Danny trying to understand my world, Danny writing me a letter that he never got to deliver. When 4 o'clock came, I was sitting in Grounded 15 minutes early, holding a cup of coffee that I had no intention of drinking. Professor Henderson arrived exactly on time, carrying a leather messenger bag that looked like it had been with him for decades. He sat down across from me and said, "Officer Chen, before you read Danny's letter, I want to tell you a few things about your brother that might help you understand what you are about to read." I said, "Okay." He said, "Danny talked about you constantly in class. When we studied portraiture, he would show us photographs of your paintings that he had taken at galleries. When we discussed color theory, he would describe techniques he had observed you using. When we covered contemporary art movements, he would argue that your work represented the best of current figurative painting." I said, "He really did that." Professor Henderson said, "He did. And it was not just admiration, Officer Chen. It was love. Danny loved you so much that he wanted to be worthy of being your brother. He felt like he needed to educate himself about art so that he could contribute something meaningful to your life instead of just being someone you had to worry about." He opened his messenger bag and pulled out a folder. He said, "I want to show you something else before you read the letter." The folder contained photographs of artwork, black and white images that I immediately recognized as Danny's photography. But these were not the experimental pieces I remembered from his photography school portfolio. These were portraits, dozens of them, showing people in moments of quiet reflection or intense emotion. Professor Henderson said, "Danny created these in the months before he died. He was working on a series he planned to call Invisible Moments, photographs that captured the inner lives of people who thought no one was watching them. I studied the images, seeing in them a maturity and sophistication that Danny's earlier work had not possessed. The composition was flawless, the lighting was dramatic and purposeful, and each photograph told a complete story about the subject's emotional state." I said, "These are incredible. Why did Danny never show them to me?" Professor Henderson said, "Because he was planning to surprise you. He wanted to have them printed and framed professionally, and he was going to display them at your gallery opening as his gift to you. He wanted to show you that he had finally created work that was worthy of standing in the same room as your paintings." I felt like someone was squeezing my chest. I said, "He never got the chance to show me these." Professor Henderson said, "No, he did not. But Officer Chen, I want you to understand something important. These photographs prove that Danny was not failing as an artist. He was evolving, growing, finding his own voice. His death was not the result of artistic inadequacy. It was the result of mental illness that prevented him from seeing his own extraordinary talent. I said, "Professor Henderson, may I read the letter now?" He said, "Of course. Take all the time you need." I opened the envelope with trembling fingers and unfolded 2 pages of Danny's careful handwriting. The letter was dated March 1, 2011, exactly 3 weeks before his death and 2 weeks before my gallery opening was scheduled to take place. The letter read, "Dear Aria, if Professor Henderson is giving you this letter, it means I was not strong enough to fight the darkness that has been growing inside me. I want you to know that my decision to leave this world has nothing to do with you and everything to do with the broken parts of my brain that I can no longer fix. I know you think I have been struggling because I am not as talented as you are, because I am jealous of your success, because I feel like a failure compared to my brilliant sister. But that is not true, Aria. I have been struggling because I have an illness that makes it impossible for me to feel the happiness and hope that should come naturally to someone with as many blessings as I have. You are the best part of my life, Aria. Watching you paint, seeing your work displayed in galleries, knowing that you are creating beauty that will outlast both of us, these things give me more joy than I have ever been able to express. When people ask me what I am most proud of, I always say I am proud to be Aria Chen's brother. I have been taking art history classes because I wanted to understand your world better. I wanted to be able to talk to you about the traditions and techniques and theories that inform your work. I was planning to surprise you at your gallery opening by actually being able to discuss the technical aspects of your portraits instead of just saying they look pretty. I know you worry that your focus on art takes time away from our relationship, but I want you to understand that your art is what makes our relationship special. I do not need you to spend more time with me, Aria. I need you to keep creating the beautiful things that remind me there is still magic in this world. The photographs I have been working on this year are my attempt to create something worthy of being called your brother's art. I do not know if they are any good, but Professor Henderson says they show promise, and working on them has been the only time in the past year when the sadness has lifted enough for me to breathe. If something happens to me, I do not want you to blame yourself or think that you should have been a different kind of sister. You have been perfect exactly as you are. I also do not want you to stop painting because you think my death is somehow connected to your success. Aria, your art is not selfish or dangerous or responsible for my illness. Your art is proof that beautiful things can exist in an ugly world. If you stop creating because of me, then my death will have destroyed something precious that should continue to bring joy to people for decades to come. I love you more than I have ever been able to say. Keep painting, keep growing, keep showing the world what you can do. Make art for both of us now. Your brother, Danny. By the time I finished reading, I was sobbing so hard that other customers in the coffee shop were starting to stare. Professor Henderson handed me tissues and waited patiently while I tried to compose myself. When I could finally speak, I said, I thought Danny killed himself because I was too selfish to pay attention to him. I thought my art had made him feel worthless and abandoned. Professor Henderson said, Officer Chen, Danny's depression was a medical condition that had nothing to do with how much attention you gave him. And your success was not a source of pain for him, it was a source of pride and inspiration. I said, but he seemed so unhappy whenever we talked about art. He always acted like he was not good enough. Professor Henderson said, that was the depression talking, not Danny. Mental illness creates a distorted lens through which everything looks hopeless and worthless, including your own abilities. But underneath that distortion, Danny was incredibly proud of what you had accomplished and excited about his own artistic growth. I said, Professor Henderson, if Danny did not want me to stop creating art, why have I been punishing myself for 12 years by refusing to paint? He said, because grief and guilt can be just as distorting as depression. You created a story about Danny's death that made you responsible for it, and then you designed a punishment that seemed to fit the crime. But Officer Chen, the story you told yourself was wrong, and the punishment you have been serving is not what Danny would have wanted for you. I said, I do not know how to go back to art after all this time. I do not even know if I still have the ability to create anything worthwhile. Professor Henderson said, Officer Chen, look at the diagram you drew today. Look at how naturally you used sophisticated artistic techniques to solve a practical problem. Your talent has not disappeared, It has just been channeled into different work. But art is not something you lose, it is something you carry with you whether you use it or not. I said, "What am I supposed to do now that I know all this?" Professor Henderson said, "That is entirely up to you. But I think Danny would want you to consider whether the life you have built as Officer Chen is really the life you want to continue living, or whether there might be room for both the police officer and the artist to coexist in the same person." He stood up to leave, then turned back to me. He said, "Officer Chen, there is one more thing. Danny's photographs, the series he was working on before he died, I still have the negatives. If you ever decide you want to see them properly printed and displayed, I would be honored to help you organize an exhibition of his work." I said, "Danny would have wanted people to see his photographs." Professor Henderson said, "I believe he would have, yes. And I think he would have wanted his sister to see that his art was worthy of standing beside hers, not competing with it, but complementing it." After Professor Henderson left, I sat in that coffee shop for 2 more hours, reading Danny's letter over and over again, trying to reconcile the brother I thought I had failed with the brother who had actually existed, the one who had loved me enough to spend his final months trying to understand my world better. For 12 years, I had been living with the wrong story about the most important relationship in my life. And if I was wrong about that, what else might I be wrong about? That night, I drove to the storage unit where I had locked away everything from my former life. I had not been there since the day I moved my art supplies and paintings 12 years ago, and I was not even sure I still had the key. But I found it buried in the back of my junk drawer, attached to a keychain Danny had given me for Christmas in 2010, a small metal paintbrush that I had forgotten I owned. The storage facility was in an industrial part of town that looked exactly the same as it had in 2011. Rows of identical metal units under harsh fluorescent lights, the smell of concrete and motor oil in the air. Unit 247 was in the back corner, and when I rolled up the metal door, I was hit by a wave of smell that transported me instantly back to my old studio. Linseed oil, turpentine, canvas, and that indefinable scent of dried paint that had once been as familiar to me as my own breathing. Everything was exactly where I had left it. My easels stood like skeletons in the dim light, draped with old sheets that had once been white but were now grey with dust. Canvases were stacked against the walls, some finished paintings that I had never displayed, others that I had abandoned halfway through. Boxes of brushes, tubes of paint, palettes crusted with colours I had mixed over a decade ago. I pulled the sheet off one of my easels and found myself looking at the last painting I had ever worked on, a portrait of a young girl that I had never finished. The face was complete, but the background was just rough sketches and colour notes, and seeing it felt like looking at evidence of a life that had been interrupted mid-sentence. I walked deeper into the unit and found the paintings I had completed for the exhibition that never happened. 12 portraits that represented the best work of my career, each one a study of a different person I had encountered in Portland. A homeless veteran with eyes that held decades of stories. A barista who transformed completely when she smiled. A construction worker whose hands showed the architecture of a lifetime spent building things. Looking at these paintings after 12 years, I could see what Professor Henderson had seen in my accident diagram. The technical skill was undeniable, but more than that, there was something in each portrait that went beyond mere representation. I had not just painted what these people looked like, I had painted who they were, had somehow captured something essential about their inner lives that made strangers stop and stare when they looked at the work. But I also understood why I had walked away from all of this. These paintings were good, maybe even great, but they had been created by someone who was so focused on her own artistic development that she had missed the signs that her brother was drowning. They represented a version of myself that I was not sure I wanted to be again. I found a box labeled Danny's Photos in my handwriting, filled with prints of his work that he had given me over the years. Looking through them now, with the knowledge of what Professor Henderson had told me about Danny's final series, I could see the evolution that had been happening in his work. The early photographs were technically competent but emotionally shallow, the kind of images that showed promise but not yet mastery. But the later photos, the ones from his final year, were different. They showed a maturity and depth that I had not recognized when he was alive. Danny had been finding his voice as an artist, developing a style that was uniquely his own, and I had been too preoccupied with my own career to notice. I spent 3 hours in that storage unit, rediscovering work that I had created and work that Danny had shared with me, trying to understand what it meant to be an artist in a world where the people you love can disappear while you are looking the other way. When I finally locked the unit and drove home, I felt like I was carrying the weight of two different futures, the one I had been living and the one I had abandoned. The next morning, I called in sick to work. I had never used a personal day for anything other than actual illness, and Sergeant Rodriguez sounded surprised when I asked for time off with no explanation. But I needed space to think, and I could not imagine trying to focus on traffic violations when my entire understanding of my life had shifted overnight. Instead of reporting to duty, I drove to the Portland Art Museum, a place I had not visited since before Danny died. I wandered through the galleries looking at paintings and sculptures that I had once studied as professional research, but now saw with the eyes of someone who had been away from art for over a decade. I found myself standing in front of a contemporary portrait by an artist I did not recognize, a painting of a woman whose expression seemed to change depending on the angle from which you viewed it. The technical execution was flawless, but what struck me most was the way the painting made me feel like I was having a conversation with the subject, like she was about to speak or had just finished saying something important. That was what I had been trying to achieve in my own portraits, that sense of connection between the viewer and the subject, the feeling that you were seeing not just someone's face but their soul. Looking at this painting, I remembered why I had fallen in love with art in the first place, and why I had been willing to spend 14 hours a day in my studio chasing that perfect moment when the paint on the canvas became more than just pigment and started to breathe. But I also thought about Danny, about his final months when I had been so absorbed in my work that I had treated his phone calls like interruptions instead of lifelines. How could I return to that level of artistic obsession knowing what it had cost me the first time? I was still pondering this question when I noticed a familiar figure across the gallery. Professor Henderson was standing in front of a display case containing historical photography, studying the images with the intense focus of someone who had spent decades teaching people how to really see art. I walked over and said, "Professor Henderson, what are you doing here?" He looked up and smiled. He said, "Officer Chen, I come here every few weeks, mostly to see if there are new acquisitions that I should know about. Old habits from my teaching days. What brings you here?" I said, "I went to my storage unit last night. I looked at all the paintings I put away 12 years ago." He said, "How did that feel?" I said, "Complicated. The work is better than I remembered, but it also reminds me of the person I was when I created it, and I'm not sure that person was someone I want to be again." Professor Henderson said, "What do you mean by that?" I said, "I was so focused on my art, so obsessed with technical perfection and career success, that I missed the signs that Danny was in trouble. What if going back to painting means going back to that kind of selfish tunnel vision?" Professor Henderson was quiet for a long moment, then he said, "Officer Chen, may I tell you something about the difference between the artist you were 12 years ago and the person you are today?" I said, "Please." He said, "12 years ago, you were a young woman who had discovered an extraordinary talent and was understandably excited about exploring its possibilities. That excitement led you to work with tremendous focus and dedication, but it also meant that you had not yet learned how to balance artistic ambition with other aspects of life." He gestured toward the portrait I had been studying. He said, "The person you are today has spent 12 years in a profession that requires you to pay attention to other people's needs, to notice details about human behavior, to understand the consequences of actions and decisions. You have developed skills in empathy and observation that you did not possess when you were 25. I said, "But what if I get so absorbed in painting again that I stop paying attention to the people around me?" Professor Henderson said, "Officer Chen, the fact that you are worried about that tells me it will not happen. 12 years ago, you did not know that artistic obsession could be dangerous. Now you do. That knowledge will change how you approach your work." He paused, then said, "Besides, who says you have to choose between being a police officer and being an artist? What if there was a way to be both?" I said, "How do you mean?" Professor Henderson said, "You have spent 12 years learning about human nature from a completely different perspective than most artists ever get. You have seen people at their worst and their best. You have dealt with conflict and tragedy and justice. That experience could inform your art in ways that would make it more powerful and meaningful than anything you created before." I said, You think I could combine police work with art? Professor Henderson said, I think you could create art that no one else could create, because no one else has your particular combination of technical training and life experience. Think about the portraits you could paint of people involved in the justice system, the stories you could tell about crime and redemption and human complexity. The idea was intriguing, but I still felt hesitant. I said, Professor Henderson, even if I wanted to try that, I do not know how to start painting again after so much time away. He said, Officer Chen, do you still have your art supplies? I said, yes, everything is in storage. He said, then you start the same way you started 12 years ago. You set up an easel, you choose a subject, and you begin. The techniques are still in your hands and your eyes. The only question is whether you have something you want to say. I said, what if I am not as good as I used to be? Professor Henderson said, what if you are better? What if 12 years of living in the world, of seeing things that most artists never see, of developing empathy and understanding, has given you something valuable to contribute to your art? That afternoon, I drove back to the storage unit and loaded my car with a single easel, a basic set of paints, and a few canvases. I was not ready to commit to moving everything back into my apartment, but I wanted to see if my hands still remembered how to hold a brush. I set up the easel in my living room, positioning it near the window where the afternoon light was strongest. I had not painted in natural light for 12 years, and I had forgotten how different it was from the artificial lighting in my old studio. Softer, more forgiving, but also more challenging because it changed constantly as the day progressed. I started with a simple still life, an apple, and a coffee mug arranged on my kitchen table. Nothing ambitious, just an exercise to see if I could still mix colors accurately and control the paint on the canvas. For the first hour, my brushstrokes felt clumsy and uncertain, like trying to write with my non-dominant hand. But gradually, muscle memory began to take over. My hand started to move with more confidence. My eyes started to see subtleties in color and light that I had forgotten I knew how to perceive. By the end of the afternoon, I had completed a small painting that was not remarkable but was undeniably competent. More importantly, I had remembered what it felt like to lose myself in the process of creation, to become so absorbed in solving the visual problems in front of me that hours passed without my awareness. But this time, instead of feeling guilty about that absorption, I felt grateful for it. For 12 years, I had denied myself this particular kind of peace, and rediscovering it felt like coming home. Over the following weeks, I developed a routine. I would work my regular shifts as a police officer, come home, and paint for 2 or 3 hours before bed. I started with simple subjects, objects around my apartment, views from my window, basic exercises to rebuild my technical confidence. But as my skills returned, I found myself wanting to paint more challenging subjects. I started sketching people I encountered during my police work, not while I was on duty, but later, from memory. A teenage shoplifter whose defiance could not hide her fear. An elderly man whose car had been stolen and who seemed more sad than angry about the violation. A domestic violence victim whose strength was visible even through her bruises. These were not the kind of subjects I had painted 12 years ago, when I had been more interested in technical challenges than in social commentary. But now I found that I was drawn to people whose stories were complicated, whose faces showed the complexity of human experience in ways that straightforward portrait subjects never had. Professor Henderson had been right. My years as a police officer had given me access to aspects of human nature that most artists never see, and that experience was changing how I approached my work. Instead of painting pretty people in flattering light, I was painting real people dealing with real problems, and the results were more emotionally powerful than anything I had created in my previous career. 3 months after rediscovering my art supplies, I had completed 12 new paintings, all portraits of people I had encountered through police work. They were different from my earlier style, rougher around the edges but more emotionally direct. They told stories instead of just displaying technical skill. I was working on a portrait of a reformed gang member who had become a community organizer when I got a phone call that changed everything. The caller identified himself as Marcus Webb, the owner of the Meridian Gallery where my cancelled exhibition was supposed to have taken place 12 years ago. He said, "Ms. Chen, I hope you remember me. I have been thinking about you for many years, and I recently learned that you might be creating art again. I said, "How did you learn that, Mr. Webb?" He said, "Professor William Henderson is a friend of mine. He mentioned that he had reconnected with you and that you were exploring the possibility of returning to artistic practice." I said, "I am not sure I would call it returning to artistic practice. I am just experimenting with painting in my spare time." Marcus said, "Ms. Chen, I saw your work 12 years ago, and it was some of the most promising contemporary portraiture I had encountered in decades. If you are creating new work, I would be very interested in seeing it." I said, "The work I am doing now is very different from what I was doing before." Marcus said, "Different how?" I said, "It is more focused on social issues, on people who are usually invisible to the art world. It might not be what gallery audiences expect." Marcus said, "Ms. Chen, the art world has changed significantly in the past 12 years. There is much more interest now in work that addresses social justice, that gives voice to marginalized communities. The kind of subjects you are describing might be exactly what contemporary audiences want to see." I said, "I am not sure I am ready to show my work publicly." Marcus said, "I understand completely. But would you be willing to let me come to your studio and see what you have been working on? No commitment, no pressure. I am just curious to see how your artistic vision has evolved." I agreed to let Marcus visit the following weekend. As soon as I hung up the phone, I felt the familiar anxiety that had always accompanied potential exhibitions. But this time, the anxiety was mixed with something else, a curiosity about whether the work I had been creating was strong enough to stand up to professional scrutiny. When Marcus arrived at my apartment, I had arranged my 12 new paintings around the living room like an impromptu gallery. He spent almost an hour studying each piece, asking questions about my subjects and my techniques, taking notes in a small leather journal. Finally, he said, "Ms. Chen, this work is extraordinary. It has all the technical sophistication of your earlier paintings, but it also has an emotional depth and social consciousness that your previous work, impressive as it was, did not possess." I said, "Do you really think so?" Marcus said, "I think you have developed into the kind of artist that the contemporary art world needs more of. Someone who can paint with technical mastery but who also has something important to say about the human condition." He paused, then said, "I would like to offer you a solo exhibition at the Meridian Gallery." "Not immediately. I think you should continue developing this body of work for another 6 months or so. But I believe these paintings deserve to be seen by a wider audience." I said, "Mr. Webb, I am not sure I am ready for that level of exposure." Marcus said, "What would make you feel ready?" I thought about the question seriously. I said, "I think I would need to complete at least 20 paintings in this series. And I would want to include some work by my brother Danny, if that would be possible." Marcus looked surprised. He said, "Your brother is also an artist." I said, "He was a photographer. He died 12 years ago, just before my last scheduled exhibition. But I recently learned that he created a remarkable series of photographs in his final months, and I think his work deserves to be seen alongside mine." Marcus said, "Ms. Chen, a joint exhibition featuring your current paintings and your brother's photography could be incredibly powerful. Would you be comfortable with that kind of presentation?" I said, "I think it would be what Danny would have wanted. He was always proud of my art, and I think he would have liked the idea of our work being displayed together." Marcus said, "Then let me propose this. You continue working for the next 8 months, aim for a body of 20 to 25 new paintings. I will work with Professor Henderson to have your brother's photographs properly printed and framed. We will schedule the exhibition for next spring, which will give us time to create the kind of meaningful presentation that both bodies of work deserve." After Marcus left, I sat in my living room surrounded by paintings that suddenly felt like the beginning of something much larger than a hobby. For the first time in 12 years, I was looking toward the future instead of away from the past, thinking about what I wanted to create rather than what I wanted to forget. But having a goal also meant having pressure, and within a few days I found myself struggling with familiar anxieties about artistic perfectionism. Every brushstroke felt crucial, every color choice seemed to carry the weight of my entire artistic comeback. I was painting portraits of people whose stories deserved to be told with honesty and skill, but I was also painting under the shadow of an exhibition deadline that made every painting feel like a test I might fail. The balance between my police work and my art became more challenging as the paintings grew more demanding. I found myself staying up until 2 or 3 in the morning, working on a portrait by lamplight, then reporting for duty at 6 am with eyes that felt like sandpaper. Sergeant Rodriguez started commenting on my appearance, asking if I was getting enough sleep, if everything was okay at home. I could not tell her that everything was more than okay, that I was rediscovering a part of myself I had thought was dead forever. How could I explain that I was voluntarily sleep-depriving myself in order to paint portraits of crime victims and reformed criminals, subjects that most people would consider depressing rather than inspiring? 3 months into my 8-month timeline, I hit my first major creative block. I had been working on a portrait of Maria Santos, a woman whose apartment had been burglarized while she was at work. During the investigation, I had been struck by the way she had focused not on what she had lost but on what the burglary meant about the safety of her neighborhood. She had started organizing community watch meetings, turning her victimization into activism. But I could not capture that transformation in paint. Every version I attempted either made her look like a victim or like a superhero, but never like the complex, determined, vulnerable person she actually was. After 2 weeks of failed attempts, I had 5 different versions of the same painting, none of them successful. I was sitting in my apartment at midnight, staring at my latest failed attempt, when I realized that my problem was not technical but emotional. I was trying to paint Maria Santos the way I thought she should be painted rather than the way I actually saw her. I was imposing a narrative about strength and resilience instead of simply observing and recording the truth of her expression. Danny had written in his letter that I should keep painting for both of us, but I had been so focused on creating work that was worthy of his memory that I had forgotten how to paint with the kind of honest observation that had made my earlier work successful. I was trying to paint with meaning instead of painting with truth. I put down my brushes and went for a walk around my neighborhood, something I had not done in months. It was a clear October night, and the streets were quiet except for the occasional car or late-night pedestrian. As I walked, I found myself really looking at the buildings and storefronts and street corners that I drove past every day for work but never really saw. On the corner of 28th and Burnside, I passed a homeless encampment that had grown significantly since the last time I had paid attention to it. There were maybe 15 tents arranged in a rough circle around a shopping cart that had been converted into a communal cooking station. A few people were still awake, sitting around a small fire in a metal barrel, talking quietly. One of the men around the fire was someone I recognized from a previous police call, a veteran named Robert whose tent had been vandalized earlier that summer. During the investigation, he had been more concerned about the safety of the other camp residents than about his own property, and he had helped me identify witnesses and collect information about the incident. As I walked past, Robert looked up and recognized me. He said, "Officer Chen, you are out late tonight." I said, "Just taking a walk, Robert. How are you doing?" He said, "Same as always. Some days better than others. But we are managing." I said, "Have there been any more problems with vandalism?" Robert said, "No, it has been quiet since those kids got arrested. Seems like word got around that messing with us was not worth the trouble." We talked for a few more minutes about neighborhood changes and safety concerns, the kind of conversation I had every day as part of my job. But as I walked home, I realized that Robert would be a perfect subject for my next painting, not because his story was particularly dramatic or inspirational, but because he was a real person dealing with real circumstances with dignity and intelligence that most people never bothered to notice. The next evening, I went back to the encampment with a small sketchbook and asked Robert if he would be willing to let me draw him. I explained that I was working on a series of portraits of people I had met through police work, people whose stories deserved to be told. Robert was intrigued by the idea. He said, "Most people who want to take pictures of us are trying to make a point about homelessness or poverty. What point are you trying to make?" I said, "I am not trying to make a point, Robert. I am trying to paint you as the person I know you are, someone who cares about his community and looks out for his neighbors. If that makes a point about homelessness, it will be because you made it, not because I imposed it." Robert agreed to sit for some sketches, and over the next week I spent several evenings at the encampment, drawing not just Robert but other residents who were interested in participating. I learned more about their individual stories, their different paths to homelessness, They're different strategies for survival and community building. When I finally started painting Robert's portrait, I approached it differently than any of the previous paintings in my series. Instead of thinking about what his story meant or what message his portrait should convey, I focused entirely on what I could observe about his face, his posture, his hands, his eyes. I painted him the way I saw him, a man of intelligence and dignity who happened to be living in circumstances that most people considered unacceptable. The resulting portrait was the best work I had completed since returning to art. It captured something essential about Robert's character without romanticizing or sensationalizing his situation. When I showed him the finished painting, he stared at it for a long time without speaking. Finally, he said, "That is how I see myself when I look in the mirror. Most people see the homeless guy, but you painted the person I am inside." That response taught me something crucial about the direction my work needed to take. The most powerful portraits were not the ones that imposed meaning on their subjects, but the ones that revealed the meaning that was already there, the humanity that existed in every person regardless of their circumstances. Over the next 4 months, I completed 15 more portraits using this approach. I painted Sarah Kim, a Korean War veteran whose car had been broken into, focusing on the way her military bearing remained visible even in civilian clothes. I painted Miguel Rodriguez, a teenager who had been caught shoplifting but whose real story was about trying to help his family pay rent. I painted Patricia Williams, a domestic violence survivor whose strength was evident not in dramatic gestures but in the quiet determination of her daily existence. Each painting required me to spend time with its subject, to understand their story not just as a police incident but as a human experience. This meant that my art was beginning to inform my police work as much as my police work was informing my art. I found myself more patient during investigations, more interested in understanding the people involved as individuals rather than just as cases to be processed. Sergeant Rodriguez noticed the change in my work. She started assigning me to cases that required more interpersonal skills, situations where understanding human motivation was as important as following procedure. She also started asking other officers to review my reports as examples of thorough documentation that captured not just the facts of incidents but the context that made those facts meaningful. In January, Professor Henderson contacted me to let me know that Danny's photographs had been professionally printed and framed. He invited me to come to his house to see the complete series that Danny had been working on before his death. Professor Henderson lived in a craftsman-style house in the Alberta neighborhood, filled with books and artwork collected over decades of teaching. He had converted his dining room into a temporary gallery space, with Danny's 23 photographs displayed around the walls in carefully chosen frames. Seeing Danny's final series properly presented was overwhelming in ways I had not expected. The photographs showed a maturity and artistic vision that I had never fully appreciated when he was alive. Each image captured a moment of private emotion, people in unguarded moments when they thought no one was watching them. There was a photograph of an elderly man feeding pigeons in a park, but the composition and lighting revealed something profound about solitude and companionship. There was an image of a young mother pushing a stroller while talking on her phone, but Danny had captured it in a way that showed both her tenderness toward her child and her exhaustion with the demands of parenthood. Professor Henderson said, Danny called this series Invisible Moments because he wanted to show the emotional lives of people who feel unseen by the world. He was particularly interested in capturing genuine human connection, moments when people revealed their true selves even in public spaces. I said, "These are incredible, Professor Henderson." Danny had found his voice as an artist. Professor Henderson said, "Yes, he had. And Officer Chen, I think you should know that several of these photographs were inspired by conversations Danny had with you about your own portrait work. He was trying to achieve in photography what you were achieving in painting, that sense of seeing past the surface to the person underneath." I said, "He was trying to paint with light the way I was trying to paint with pigment." Professor Henderson said, "Exactly. Which is why I think displaying your work together will create a dialogue between your artistic approaches, showing how two artists in the same family developed different techniques to explore similar themes." Over the next 2 months, I completed the final paintings for my series while working with Marcus Webb and Professor Henderson to plan the exhibition. We decided to call it Seen and Unseen, Portraits of Hidden Lives, with my paintings representing people who are often invisible to mainstream society and Danny's photographs showing the invisible emotional lives of ordinary people. The exhibition was scheduled to open in April, exactly 13 years after my original show had been cancelled. As the opening date approached, I found myself experiencing the same mixture of excitement and terror that I had felt before every exhibition in my previous career. But this time, the anxiety was balanced by something I had not possessed 13 years ago: the knowledge that the work I was presenting was not just technically accomplished but personally meaningful. 2 weeks before the opening, Marcus arranged for a local art critic to preview the exhibition and write a review that would appear in the city's alternative weekly newspaper. Jennifer Walsh had been covering the Portland art scene for over a decade, and her opinion carried significant weight with collectors and other galleries. Jennifer spent over an hour studying the paintings and photographs, taking notes and asking questions about my return to art and the circumstances behind Danny's work. When she finished her review, she asked if she could interview me for a longer profile piece that would run in the Sunday art section of the main newspaper. During the interview, Jennifer asked me about the relationship between my police work and my art, and whether I planned to continue both careers or focus entirely on painting. I said, "I have learned that my experiences as a police officer have made me a better artist, and my return to art has made me a better police officer. I do not see them as competing interests anymore, but as complementary ways of understanding and serving my community." Jennifer said, "That is an unusual perspective. Most artists talk about needing to protect their creative work from the demands of other obligations." I said, 12 years ago, I might have agreed with that. But now I think my art is stronger because it comes from a life that includes other kinds of work and responsibility. My paintings are informed by real-world experience in ways that purely studio-based work could never be. Jennifer said, "Do you think your brother would have approved of the direction your work has taken?" I said, "I think Danny would have been proud that I found a way to combine technical skill with social consciousness. He was always interested in art that revealed hidden aspects of human experience, and I think he would have appreciated work that gives visibility to people who are usually overlooked." The interview was scheduled to run 3 days before the exhibition opening, which meant that people would have time to read it and decide whether they wanted to attend. I had mixed feelings about the publicity, grateful for the attention but nervous about whether the work could live up to whatever expectations the article might create. The night before the exhibition opened, I went to the gallery for a final walkthrough. My 23 new paintings hung alongside Danny's 23 photographs, creating visual conversations across the room. My portrait of Robert, the homeless veteran, was displayed near Danny's photograph of the elderly man feeding pigeons, both images showing dignity in circumstances that society often treats as invisible. Marcus had arranged the lighting perfectly, with each piece illuminated to show its finest details while maintaining the overall atmosphere of contemplation and respect that the subject matter demanded. Small plaques next to each piece provided basic information without over-explaining the content, allowing viewers to form their own relationships with the work. Standing in that gallery space, surrounded by art that represented both my own growth as a person and Danny's final artistic achievement, I felt something I had not experienced in 13 years. Pride in work that I had created not just for myself but for the people whose stories deserved to be told. The exhibition opening was scheduled for 6 o'clock on a Friday evening in April. I arrived at 4:30 to help with final preparations and found Marcus directing the catering setup while Professor Henderson made last-minute adjustments to the lighting. The gallery looked perfect, transformed into a space that honored both the technical accomplishment of the artwork and the dignity of its subjects. I had invited everyone whose portrait was included in the show, though I knew not all of them would be able to attend. Robert from the homeless encampment had cleaned up and borrowed a suit from a local church clothing program. Maria Santos came with 3 generations of her family, proud to show them her portrait. Miguel Rodriguez brought his mother, who had never been inside an art gallery before but who stared at her son's painting with tears in her eyes. The turnout exceeded everyone's expectations. By 7 o'clock, the gallery was packed with people I had never seen before, art collectors and critics and community members who had read Jennifer Walsh's preview article. But what moved me most was seeing my police colleagues mixed in with the art world crowd, Sergeant Rodriguez and 5 other officers from my district who had come to support what they called my other job. The most meaningful moment came when Sarah Kim, the Korean War veteran whose portrait was one of my favorites, approached me near the end of the evening. She had been studying her painting for several minutes, and when she turned to speak to me, her eyes were bright with emotion. She said, "Officer Chen, I want you to know that this painting shows me something I had forgotten about myself." I said, "What is that, Mrs. Kim?" She said, "It shows me that I am still the soldier I used to be. Not because of my uniform or my service record, but because of something in my character that has not changed in 70 years. You painted the person I am inside, the person I was proud to be when I was young." She paused, then continued, "My grandchildren are here tonight, and they have never understood why my military service was so important to me. But when they look at this painting, they see what you saw, and now they understand why I am proud of what I did for my country." That conversation reminded me why I had returned to art, and why combining it with my police work felt so right. I was not just creating beautiful objects, I was creating records of human dignity that might otherwise go unnoticed and unremembered. The critical response to the exhibition was overwhelmingly positive. Jennifer Walshy's review called it a breakthrough show that demonstrated how art could serve social justice without sacrificing aesthetic excellence. 2 other galleries contacted Marcus about representing my work, and a photography museum in Seattle expressed interest in acquiring several of Danny's prints for their permanent collection. But the response that mattered most to me came from the people whose portraits were displayed. Over the following weeks, many of them contacted me to say that seeing their stories treated with artistic seriousness had changed how they saw themselves. Maria Santos told me that having her portrait in a gallery had given her confidence to run for city council. Miguel Rodriguez said that explaining his painting to visitors had helped him articulate his own goals for the future in ways he had never been able to before. The success of the exhibition created new pressures and opportunities that I had not anticipated. Marcus wanted to schedule a follow-up show for the following year, which would require me to create an entirely new body of work while continuing my police duties. Other galleries in different cities were interested in hosting traveling versions of Seen and Unseen. Art schools were inviting me to speak about combining social activism with traditional portraiture techniques. All of this attention was gratifying, but it also forced me to make decisions about how much of my life I wanted to dedicate to art versus other commitments. I loved painting, and I was proud of the work I had created, but I also loved my job as a police officer and the direct impact it allowed me to have on my community. After several weeks of consideration, I decided to propose a new arrangement to my police department. Instead of working full-time, I would reduce my schedule to 3 days per week, which would give me time to maintain my artistic practice while continuing to serve as an officer. The department was initially skeptical, but Sergeant Rodriguez supported the proposal, arguing that my dual perspective had made me more effective at community policing and that other officers could benefit from my example. The arrangement was approved on a trial basis, and I began working Tuesday through Thursday as a police officer and Friday through Monday as an artist. This schedule allowed me to spend extended time with portrait subjects, to develop relationships with community members whose stories deserved artistic attention, and to create work at a pace that prioritized quality over quantity. 6 months after the exhibition opened, I received an unexpected phone call from Danny's former roommate at photography school, a man named Aria Chen who had moved to New York to work as a commercial photographer. He had seen an article about the exhibition online and wanted to tell me something about Danny that he thought I should know. Alex said, "Aria, I hope this is not too painful to discuss, but I wanted you to understand how much your brother loved and admired your work." I said, "Thank you, Alex. It means a lot to hear that." Alex said, "But there is something specific I think you should know. In the weeks before Danny died, he was working on a surprise project for you. He had been secretly photographing people at your gallery openings, capturing candid moments of viewers responding to your paintings." I felt my breath catch. I said, "What do you mean?" Alex said, "Danny wanted to create a photographic record of how your art affected people. The expressions on their faces when they first saw one of your portraits, the conversations they had while standing in front of your work. He thought it would be a meaningful gift to show you the impact your paintings had on strangers." Alex continued, he had taken over 100 photographs at 3 different gallery events, and he was planning to have them printed and bound into a book that he would give you after your next exhibition. He called it The Audience for Aria, and he was so excited about surprising you with it. I said, "What happened to those photographs?" Alex said, "After Danny died, his parents packed up all his belongings, including his photography equipment and negatives. I tried to tell them about the project, but they were so overwhelmed with grief that I do not think they understood what I was describing. The negatives might still be in storage somewhere, if they were not thrown away." That evening, I called my parents for the first time in over a year. Our relationship had been strained since Danny's death, partly because of my decision to leave art and become a police officer, which they saw as a rejection of everything our family had valued. But when I told them about Alex's phone call and asked if they still had Danny's photography equipment, my mother broke down crying. She said, "Aria, we have boxes of Danny's things in the basement that we have never been able to go through. It has been too painful to look at his photographs, knowing that he thought they were not good enough when they were actually beautiful." I said, "Mom, would you be willing to let me come look through those boxes? There might be something important that Danny was working on before he died." My parents agreed to let me visit the following weekend. I had not been in their house since Danny's funeral, and walking through the door brought back memories of family dinners and holiday celebrations and the ordinary happiness of growing up with a brother who shared my love of creating beautiful things. The boxes in the basement contained not just Danny's photography equipment but also journals where he had written about his artistic goals and development. Reading his entries from the final months of his life, I discovered a person who was much more optimistic about his future than I had realized at the time. One entry, dated 2 weeks before his death, read, "Saw Aria's latest painting today when I stopped by her studio. She is working on something completely new, a portrait that combines technical precision with emotional depth in ways that make me proud to be related to someone so talented. I cannot wait to show her the audience photographs when they are finished. I think she will be surprised to see how powerfully her work affects people who have never met her but who understand immediately what she is trying to communicate through paint." Among the boxes, I found 3 contact sheets of the photographs Danny had taken at my gallery openings. Even in the small proof images, I could see that his candid portraits of viewers were as sophisticated as any of his other work. He had captured moments of genuine connection between strangers and artwork, people discovering something about themselves through looking at paintings. I also found something I had not expected: a folder labeled Aria's work containing photographs Danny had taken of my paintings over the years. These were not documentation photos but artistic interpretations, images that showed my portraits from unusual angles or in different lighting conditions that revealed aspects of the work I had never noticed. Looking through this folder, I realized that Danny had been creating his own artistic response to my paintings long before he started the audience project. He had been in visual dialogue with my work, using his camera to explore and extend the ideas I was developing with paint. We had been collaborating as artists without either of us fully understanding what we were doing. Professor Henderson helped me have Danny's audience photographs properly printed from the original negatives. When I saw the full series, I understood why Danny had been so excited about the project. The images showed people of all ages and backgrounds having authentic emotional responses to my work, children pointing excitedly at details in paintings, elderly viewers wiping away tears, couples discussing what they saw in the portraits. These photographs provided evidence of something I had never fully believed about my own work, that it actually connected with people in the ways I hoped it would. Seeing strangers respond to my paintings with genuine emotion validated not just my technical skills but my ability to communicate human experience through visual art. I decided to include Danny's audience photographs in my next exhibition, creating a show that would demonstrate the full cycle of artistic communication from creation to reception. The paintings would show my perspective on the subjects I had chosen to portray, while Danny's photographs would show how viewers completed that communication by bringing their own experiences and emotions to the work. This exhibition, titled The Complete Conversation, opened 18 months after Seen and Unseen. It featured my newest series of portraits alongside Danny's audience photographs and his interpretive images of my earlier paintings. The critical response was even stronger than before, with several reviewers commenting on the unique intimacy of seeing both sides of the artistic dialogue between creator and viewer. But the most meaningful response came from my parents, who attended the opening and spent over an hour studying Danny's photographs. Seeing his work displayed professionally, treated with the same respect as my paintings, helped them understand that their son had been a serious artist whose death had interrupted a promising career rather than ending a life of failure. My father said, "I wish Danny could have seen his photographs displayed like this. I think it would have helped him understand how talented he really was." My mother said, "Maybe he can see them, in whatever way the dead see the things that happen after they are gone. Maybe he knows that his work is finally being seen and appreciated the way it deserved to be." 3 years after my return to art, I have found a balance between my two careers that allows me to serve my community in multiple ways. My police work informs my artistic subjects, while my artistic practice makes me more empathetic and observant in my law enforcement duties. I have created over 60 new portraits of people I have encountered through police work, and I continue to discover Danny's photographs that provide new insights into his artistic vision and the relationship between our work. The storage unit where I kept my art supplies for 12 years has been converted into a proper studio space. But I also have a small easel set up in my apartment, and I sometimes paint there in the evenings while thinking about the cases I worked that day and the people whose stories might deserve artistic attention. I have learned that guilt and grief can create narratives about our lives that are completely false, but that it is never too late to discover the truth and change direction. For 12 years, I believed that my art had contributed to my brother's death, but the real story was that my art had been one of the sources of joy and pride in his life. I have also learned that talents and passions are not selfish indulgences but gifts that we can use to serve something larger than ourselves. My return to painting has allowed me to give visibility to people who are often overlooked, to create records of dignity and humanity that might otherwise be lost. Most importantly, I have learned that the people we love want us to use our gifts fully, not hide them out of misplaced guilt or fear. Danny did not want me to stop painting because he died. He wanted me to keep painting because that was how his memory could continue to inspire beauty in the world. Today, I continue working as both a police officer and a professional artist, and I have never been happier with the life I have built. My work is displayed in galleries across the country, but it is also present in community centers and public buildings where the people I paint can see their stories being told with respect and care. Every time I complete a new portrait, I think about Danny and the letter he wrote asking me to keep creating beautiful things no matter what happened to him. I think about the photographs he took of people responding to my work, evidence of the connection between artist and audience that makes all creative work meaningful. I paint now not just for myself, but for my brother who will never paint again, for the subjects whose stories deserve to be told, and for the viewers who will discover something about themselves by looking closely at the faces I have chosen to preserve in paint. I want to hear from you about talents or passions you may have abandoned because of guilt, trauma, or misunderstanding. Have you ever convinced yourself that something you loved was dangerous or selfish when it was actually a gift you could use to serve others? What would the people who care about you want you to reclaim about your creative life? Let me know in the comments below, and please share your own stories about returning to abandoned dreams or discovering that the thing you thought you needed to hide was actually your greatest contribution to the world. If this story about reclaiming hidden talents and honoring lost loved ones inspired you, please hit that like button. It really helps me continue sharing these important stories about finding your way back to yourself and using your gifts to serve something larger than your own success. And if you want to hear more stories about people who discovered that guilt and fear had been preventing them from living their fullest lives, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Remember, your talents are not personal possessions to be hoarded or hidden, but gifts that you can use to create beauty, connection, and understanding in a world that desperately needs more of all three. Sometimes the best way to honor someone's memory is not to sacrifice what they loved about you, but to continue developing and sharing the gifts that brought them joy. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.